Hello, housing providers and property managers. Welcome to another episode of the Fair Housing Insiders. Today, we're going to be talking about a terrible four-letter word. That's right, mold. And believe it or not, it has a lot of fair housing compliance issues. So let's dive right in. Hello, property managers. Today, we're going to be talking about mold when it turns into a fair housing matter and how you navigate the compliance and the complaints. This is going to be a really intense episode, guys. Obviously, every property manager and housing provider is terrified of mold. But what we may not know is it goes beyond maintenance. It goes beyond walls. It goes beyond ducts. It also has compliance and fair housing issues with it as well. And that's why we brought in Kathi Williams she is a fair housing attorney and, of course, is with us here at the Fair Housing Institute. Kathi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here, Michael. And this is one of those topics we wish we didn't have to talk about, but we do.
Very true. Very true. Nobody wants to deal with mold. And we certainly can't tell you everything about treating mold, about replacing drywall, but we do know the fair housing side of things. So let's start when does mold become a fair housing issue, Kathi?
You know, mold is a serious issue even before it becomes a fair housing issue. But once it becomes a fair housing issue, there are additional issues that you need to be careful of. So that's why we thought it was important that we talk about it today. So for instance, if someone says they're having a mold problem and your usual procedure is to send maintenance in to check that out, and maintenance comes back and says, no, there's no mold issue in this apartment. If the resident says they are getting sick from that mold and they continue to complain about it, then you can't stop your actions as a landlord at the point where you have maintenance deal with it. You've got to go farther and beyond that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Obviously, I'm sure the first thing in every property manager's head is, oh no, I've got mold. But then, you hear you do the test, nothing's there, but you may not know you need to start going those extra steps once those residents start bringing up those complaints. So what do you have to do to defend against a complaint, claiming that there's a presence of mold, they're getting sick, that kind of thing?
It is absolutely essential that you bring in a third-party mold expert. And there are plenty of private companies out there that do this kind of investigation and analysis. You know, the reality is there's mold everywhere. There's mold in all of our homes, every place in our homes. So the issue with a third-party professional is to explain the types of mold that are present and the level of the mold that is in existence in any apartment or room in that apartment. And that's the kind of report that you have to rely on then in deciding how far you need to go for remuneration of that mold.
Gotcha. Okay. And this would all be looped into the resident potentially having a disability like allergies or something like that, correct?
That's correct. So when it becomes a fair housing issue is when the resident is saying to you, whatever you've done is not enough, and I'm getting sick because of what you haven't done. So you begin with a reasonable accommodation process, examining and verifying whether this resident does have a disability, and if so, whether that disability could be impacted by the presence of mold in their apartment.
That makes sense. And for all our listeners out there, remember, we've said it a million times that we use terms like reasonable accommodations and disabilities, but the resident may not. And that doesn't change the facts of what's going on. Just because they didn't use the term reasonable accommodation or disability doesn't mean that you don't still need to follow the steps and procedures. So just keep that in mind.
That's a really good point, Michael, that sometimes you're looking at it as a landlord as a mold issue. But the minute they start talking about that mold making them sick, or they can't breathe, or it's giving them heart problems, at that point, you have to assume you're talking about a reasonable accommodation request.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to know the do's and don'ts of fair housing compliance. All right. So, Kathi, obviously, documentation is a big part of what we teach here at the Fair Housing Institute on every level of housing. So, I'd imagine documentation needs to be involved here, too. So, what documents should landlords, property managers be keeping in their file related to this situation?
Okay, so in a typical case of a resident claiming that mold is making them sick in their apartment, these are the kind of things that should be in your file at the end of the day. First of all, the fact that the resident made a request, or that you heard a request and then went to them to talk about the fact is, are they claiming that the mold is making them sick because of a disability? So you get it in the record that the resident made a claim of reasonable accommodation. Next, any actions you take to determine or verify whether indeed that resident does have a disability and whether it is connected to the potential presence of mold in that unit. Then you go into what actions you took to engage a third-party professional, including their analysis and summary of their investigation of mold. And of course, the important part is whether there were types of mold in that unit and levels of the various types of mold, which could be dangerous to a person with a disability. If that exists, then you've got to show that you took actions to eradicate that mold at that level from that apartment. And then last but not least is your communications throughout this entire process with the resident. How much did you inform them? Sometimes you have to educate them a little bit because they don't realize that mold is always going to be present. So you have to show them that it is at the level of the mold that is the danger and sometimes the type of mold. So all of that back and forth and the communication that takes place needs to be thoroughly documented.
As always, documentation ends up being the cornerstone of fair housing compliance. Guys, this is just another example of how you really have to follow your process start to finish. I can't tell you how many times, we kind of gave you a little bit of a scenario here, but I can't tell you how many times I've heard of managers, like they go through the process of having maintenance tests for mold, nothing comes back, and that's where they want to stop because they think they don't have to go any further. And when your resident is making the claim that they are having a reaction to the mold, you have to follow the process all the way through, or mold will just become one of your concerns. Then a fair housing complaint can be right on top of that. So a really serious topic. I know that mold's already scary, so to add that much more on it might be a lot, but it's important that you guys understand this today. So Kathi, thank you so much for being with us. This has been another great episode of the Fair Housing Insiders. Please make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Share it with your team because, as you just saw, how important all this information really is. We really appreciate you being a part of our community. Please send in your questions, send in your topics. We'd love to hear from you. And check us again on another episode of the Fair Housing Insiders. Happy training.